Tyler Grant performed through the entire dinner. The wine, the business card dropped in front of me like a consolation prize, the Gulf Coast contract, he announced, as if it were already his legacy. Every word was calibrated to show how little I counted. What he never considered was the one detail he had said without thinking. He had claimed credit for a deal that hadn't existed for 3 days. As my wife's hand came across my face and Tyler leaned back, smiling, I found myself with one quiet question. Did he ever wonder who had the authority to cancel it? If you want to hear stories about quiet power, real consequences, and the kind of justice that doesn't announce itself, this channel is exactly that. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My father left me 2 things when he died: a company worth almost nothing, and a watch worth even less. The watch was old, the kind with a scratched face and a leather band worn soft from years of daily use. He wore it every day of his adult life, not because it was valuable, but because it kept time, and he believed a man who respected time respected everything else that mattered. I put it on the morning of his funeral and never took it off. 15 years later, I was still wearing it at the head of a $50 billion company, and people still mistook it for the watch of a man who hadn't made it. That misreading was never accidental on my part. Kane Global operated across energy, logistics, and technology sectors that moved quietly and rewarded discipline over spectacle. I had built it from the fragments my father left behind, expanded it through years of decisions that never made headlines and never needed to. I ran the company through a board and a senior leadership team that handled the public face of things. Most regional employees had never seen me in person. That anonymity was deliberate, and for a long time it felt like a kind of strength. Then I married Hannah Harper, and I began to understand that the same silence that protected the company made me invisible inside my own home. Hannah and I had 6 years together. The first 2 were genuinely good. She loved that I didn't perform, didn't need applause, didn't fill rooms with noise. She called it steadiness. Over time, she began calling it something else: stagnation, smallness, an inability to want more. She started comparing our life to the lives of her friends, the vacations, the titles, the brand of car in the driveway. I understood the shift, but couldn't stop it. She had decided that calm was a symptom of failure, and no amount of quiet evidence to the contrary was going to change that reading. 8 months before that dinner, I was at my desk when a voicemail came through on my phone, a message Hannah had meant to send to someone else and sent to me by mistake. In it, she said she just needed to finish moving a portion of the shared assets before she left. Her voice was casual, almost businesslike, the way people sound when they're talking about logistics, not the end of a marriage. I sat there listening to it twice before I understood what I was actually hearing. I didn't confront her. I started listening instead to the pattern of calls, the gaps in schedules, the hotel charges on the household account, the jewelry she wore on days she said she was visiting friends. Piece by piece, a picture assembled itself. The man at the center of it was Tyler Grant, a regional manager within my own company. Tyler was the kind of man who understood the performance of success better than success itself. He wore his ambition on the outside: expensive suits, a gold watch he had bought to signal arrival, stories about high-stakes contracts told with the confidence of someone who had won them rather than inherited the opportunity to pitch them. He worked for Kane Global and used that fact constantly, invoking the company's name like borrowed credibility. What he never knew, what no one in that corner of the organization knew, was that the quiet man Hannah had stopped respecting had built every room Tyler walked into. As I gathered documentation over those 8 months, I discovered that Tyler hadn't just been sleeping with my wife. He had been billing the company for it: hotels, jewelry, travel, nearly $20,000 in fabricated client entertainment expenses. He had also been leaking contract details he had no clearance to share, using internal information to inflate his standing with people like Hannah's father. I had enough to act long before the night of the dinner. What I was waiting for was clarity, not about what to do, but about why I was doing it. I needed to be certain that what I wanted was the right outcome, not just a satisfying one. Hannah called me 3 days before to say her family was hosting an important dinner and that I needed to be there. She said it the way she had been saying most things to me by then, as instruction, not invitation. She did not mention Tyler would be there. The morning of the dinner, I was in the study when I heard her in the hallway speaking quietly into her phone. She didn't know I was home. I heard her say that tonight she would make sure he understood who she actually respected. I knew then exactly what the evening was designed to be. I went anyway. Not because I was unprepared, and not because I thought there was anything left to save. I went because some moments need to be witnessed to be complete, and the people in that house deserved to see exactly what they had been building toward. The Harper home was large and well appointed in the way of families who had always had money and wanted everyone to know it. Harold Hannah's father had spent 30 years in commercial banking and measured people by their job title the way other men measured them by their handshake. Evelyn, her mother, was warmer on the surface but colder underneath, the kind of woman who expressed disappointment through courtesy. Hannah's brother Kellen had turned cruelty into a social skill. He delivered insults as jokes and expected gratitude for the entertainment. They had never liked me. Not because I had done anything to earn their dislike, but because I hadn't done enough to earn their approval, which amounted to the same thing in that house. Evelyn greeted me at the door with the smile she reserved for people she found unfortunate. Harold asked whether I was still with the consulting group, the same question he asked every time, knowing it would land as a diminishment. Kellen made a comment about how Hannah had spent the best years of her life waiting for me to become someone. He said it with a laugh, the way he always did, as if laughter were a pardon. My seat had been arranged at the far end of the table, as far from the center of the room as the furniture allowed. Tyler arrived 20 minutes later. He came through the door carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's grocery runs, and a gift for Hannah wrapped in tissue paper. The family received him the way they might receive someone returning from a successful campaign. Harold gripped his hand with both of his own. Evelyn beamed. Kellen straightened in his chair. Tyler sat beside Hannah and immediately began talking about the Gulf Coast contract, a logistics deal he claimed he was days away from closing on behalf of Kane Global, a deal that would by his telling place him in senior leadership and cement a legacy he had been building toward his entire career. Harold raised a glass. Evelyn looked at Hannah with an expression that said everything she had ever believed about my inadequacy was being confirmed in real time. Kellen turned to me and asked with a grin whether I had ever been inside a boardroom as important as the ones Tyler operated in. The table laughed. Tyler set his business card in front of me with the deliberate care of someone placing something where it didn't belong. "Once Gulf Coast closes," Tyler said, "I might be able to find you something entry-level. At least Hannah won't have to keep explaining you." The room found this funny. I looked at the card for a moment, then at Tyler, and said that he shouldn't be promising positions on the basis of a contract that no longer existed. He blinked just once quickly before the confidence resettled on his face. He asked what authority I had to comment on Kane Global's internal operations. I told him that separately he probably shouldn't be using company funds to buy gifts for another man's wife. The shift in the room was immediate. The laughter stopped. Tyler glanced at Hannah, recalibrating, and adopted the expression of someone who had been publicly insulted and expected an apology for it. Hannah stood up. She looked at me and said I needed to apologize to Tyler right now. I told her I wouldn't apologize to someone for telling the truth. What happened next was fast. Hannah crossed the room, and before anyone moved or spoke, the sound of the slap filled the dining room. The ring on her hand caught the corner of my mouth and split the skin there. The room went completely silent. Hannah stood in front of me and said, voice raised, that I had no right to embarrass a man who had shown her what a real life looked like. Tyler said nothing. He sat where he was with his wine glass and a smile that said he believed he had just won something. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't reach for Tyler, and I didn't look at the rest of the table. I picked up the cloth napkin beside my plate and pressed it briefly to the corner of my mouth. Then I looked at Hannah for a long moment and told her that the slap hadn't hurt nearly as much as watching her protect someone she already knew was lying. She said Tyler wasn't lying and that I was only angry because I couldn't measure up to him. I turned to Tyler and told him to enjoy the evening, that tomorrow morning he had a very important meeting with his CEO. Tyler laughed. He thought I was bluffing or possibly unraveling, and he seemed to find both possibilities equally entertaining. I didn't respond to the laugh. I walked out of the dining room through the front hallway and into the cool air outside without looking back. In the car, I touched the face of my father's watch and called Jasmine, my executive assistant. I kept my voice low and steady. I asked her to send Tyler Grant a meeting request for 7 the following morning from the CEO's office, floor 34, without identifying who the CEO was. Just an opportunity for discussion. I also asked her to send a formal investment meeting invitation to the entire Harper family for 2:45 that same afternoon. She confirmed without questions the way she always did. Then I asked her to have the audit documentation, the legal files, and the board connection ready before I arrived. She said it would be done. I sat in the car for a moment after I ended the call. The bleeding at the corner of my mouth had already slowed. I pressed the napkin against it one more time and thought about my father. Not the company he'd left, but the watch, and what he'd meant when he gave it to me. He told me once that the value of a man isn't in what he displays, but in what he protects. I had spent 8 months protecting something not my pride, not my position, but the truth. And I had waited long enough to know I wasn't doing what came next out of anger. The dinner hadn't created a plan. The dinner had simply removed the last reason to delay one. I see, to the lover meets his real employer. 389 words. I arrived at the Kane Global Tower before 6 the following morning. The building was mostly quiet at that hour. A few security staff, the overnight systems team, the low hum of servers doing their work without anyone watching. I took the elevator to the 34th floor and walked into the executive dining room alone. Jasmine had prepared everything the night before: the audit file, Tyler's personnel record, the legal correspondence, and a printed timeline of transactions that ran from the first misclassified expense to the most recent hotel charge. I arranged these on the table in front of me, poured a cup of coffee from the carafe by the window, and waited. The scratch at the corner of my mouth had started to close overnight. It was still visible, but the sting was gone. I want to be honest about what I was feeling in that room because it would be easy to describe it as calm and leave it at that. There was calm, genuine calm, the kind that comes from having made a decision and knowing it was the right one. But underneath it was something more complicated. 8 months of documentation. 8 months of watching my own marriage dissolve from the inside while I gathered evidence with the same discipline I applied to any other problem the company had ever faced. There is something exhausting about being methodical in circumstances that deserve grief. I had chosen method over feeling for a long time, and sitting at that table I understood that method had protected me and cost me something at the same time. The meeting request Jasmine sent had said only that the CEO wished to discuss a significant opportunity. No name, no department, no further context. She had learned over the years that ambiguity, when controlled, was its own kind of authority. Tyler arrived at 7 minutes past 7. He came through the glass door with the energy of a man who believed the morning was already his jacket-pressed posture. Easy. The particular confidence of someone certain he was about to be rewarded. He saw me at the head of the table and stopped. His expression ran through several things: quickly recognition, irritation, suspicion, and finally a kind of dismissive certainty that I had somehow ended up in a room I had no business being in. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I have a meeting with the CEO." I told him he was in the right room. He looked around, checking the doorway behind him as if he expected someone else to appear and explain the situation. When no one did, I gestured to the chair across from me and told him to sit down. He didn't move immediately. He asked again where the CEO was, his voice carrying the first edge of unease beneath the confidence. "He's sitting in front of you," I said. The silence that followed had a particular quality to it. Not disbelief exactly, more like the moment before disbelief arrives, when the mind is still refusing to process what the ears have just delivered. I introduced myself, fully founder of Kane Global, controlling shareholder, chairman of the board, chief executive of a company currently valued at approximately $50 billion. I said it without emphasis, the way you state facts that don't require decoration. I watched Tyler's face process the information in stages. He looked at my watch first, the old one, the scratched face, the worn leather band, then at the suit, which was well made but not ostentatious, then back at my face and at the small cut at the corner of my mouth from his girlfriend's ring. The smile he had been wearing since he walked in disappeared piece by piece, like a light source being gradually covered. He was remembering, I could tell, the dinner table, the seat at the far end, Harold's dismissive questions, Kellen's jokes. His own business card dropped in front of me like a tip left for service staff. He was understanding in real time that every promotion he had ever received, every door that had ever opened for him inside that building, every contract he had ever been handed to pitch, all of it had originated with the man he had watched get slapped by a woman he was sleeping with while he sat back and smiled. I opened the audit file. The numbers were straightforward, and I walked through them without commentary. Tyler had submitted $31,000 in client entertainment expenses over the previous 14 months. $11,000 of that was legitimate client dinners, travel related to active accounts, conference registration. The remaining $20,000 had paid for hotel rooms, jewelry, and 2 extended weekend trips. The receipts were itemized. The dates corresponded exactly with the timeline I had assembled from phone records and Hannah's own calendar. The jewelry Tyler had brought to the Harper dinner, the piece Hannah had unwrapped with such obvious pleasure, appeared on line 47 of the document as a fabricated vendor lunch. Beyond the financial irregularities, Tyler had shared details of the Gulf Coast contract with people outside the organization. He had described the deal's scope, its projected value, and its timeline to Hannah's father over dinner on at least 2 documented occasions, using non-public information to build his personal image with a man whose approval he was cultivating. He had also represented to the Harper family that he held authority to finalize agreements well above his actual clearance level. None of this was authorized. All of it was on record. I turned on the projection screen behind me. The board members joined by video, 4 of them arranged in a grid, present as witnesses and as process. Tyler looked at the screen and seemed to understand for the first time that this was not a confrontation. It was a proceeding. I tried to reframe things. He said Hannah had told him the marriage was effectively over, that he had understood they were separated in every meaningful sense. I told him the state of my marriage was not a matter Kane Global was positioned to adjudicate, but the $20,000 he had taken from the company's accounts most certainly was. He shifted approaches, said he had planned to pay it back, that the Gulf Coast deal would have more than covered it, that no real harm had come to the organization. I told him the Gulf Coast contract had been removed from consideration 3 days before the dinner. The risk assessment team had flagged his file weeks earlier, long before he stood in the Harper dining room announcing a legacy he was building. He had not been close to a promotion. He had been close to a very different kind of conversation. I slid the termination letter across the table. His access badge would be deactivated at the end of the meeting. His system credentials had already been suspended that morning. The legal department would be in contact regarding repayment of the misappropriated funds, and a notification would be sent to relevant industry contacts confirming the termination, and its basis kept factual, kept professional. Nothing beyond what the documentation supported. Tyler looked at the letter for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost most of its shape. He said he had a family. He said his career had taken years to build. He said he hadn't meant for things to go as far as they had. I believed the last part. I don't think Tyler was a man with a long-range scheme. I think he was a man who had made a series of individually reckless decisions and had never encountered a moment of genuine consequence until now. I told him he hadn't lost his career because he had fallen for the wrong woman. He had lost it because he had been dishonest in every room he walked into with the company, with the people he was supposed to serve, with himself. When the security team came to escort him out, he left without further argument. The glass door closed behind him and the room was quiet again. The Harper family arrived at 2:45 in the afternoon. Jasmine met them in the lobby and brought them up in the elevator. I had asked her to give them no information in advance, just that they were expected, that the meeting was significant, and that they should come as arranged. Hannah came in wearing something she had chosen carefully, the kind of outfit selected for an occasion she expected to be triumphant. She looked around the 34th floor with the expression of someone confirming a belief she had already formed. Harold had brought a leather portfolio, presumably containing notes on his banking background. Evelyn carried herself with the composure of a woman arriving to collect something owed. Kellen was still making comments in the hallway. I heard his voice through the glass before the door opened, Something about the irony of the little consulting man having a better parking spot than he did. When Jasmine opened the door and they walked in, they saw the long table, the board members on screen, the folders with Kane Global's header, the two members of the security team standing near the wall, and me at the head of it all. Tyler's chair was empty. The cut at the corner of my mouth was still faintly visible in the afternoon light. Evelyn recognized me first. Her expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite control. The social composure she maintained so reliably cracked at the edges for just a moment. Harold stopped walking. Kellen looked around the room as though he expected to find the real meeting happening somewhere else. Hannah asked where Tyler was. I told her Tyler Grant no longer worked at this company. Then I stood and said my name, my full name, and described my role: founder, owner, CEO of Kane Global, valued at approximately $50 billion. I gestured to the room around and told them that everything Tyler had used to impress them, every room he had claimed authority in, every deal he had taken credit for, all of it existed because of the man they had seated at the far end of the table the previous evening. Harold's eyes moved to one of the board members on screen, a man he had apparently cited more than once as a model of legitimate success. The board member gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Harold said nothing. The color in his face said enough. I opened the folder in front of Hannah and walked her through what the audit had found. The vase of Tyler had brought to the house 2 months ago company funds. The hotel in San Antonio where she thought they had celebrated her promotion company funds. The bracelet she was wearing at that moment purchased on a fabricated client account company funds. Every romantic gesture Tyler had made toward her over the course of 14 months had been paid for in part or in full with money he had taken from the organization he worked for. The man she had defended as self-made, successful, generous had built the performance of those qualities with someone else's resources, specifically with mine. Hannah reached up and touched the bracelet on her wrist. She didn't take it off. I don't think she knew what to do with her hands. I told them that I had retained a family law attorney and that the divorce filing was already in process. The legal structures protecting my personal assets and my ownership stake in Kane Global had been established years before the marriage and were not subject to division. Hannah would not be receiving any portion of the company. Hannah moved toward me then. She looked at the mark on my face, and I watched her understand fully and for the first time what the slap had actually cost her, not in legal terms, but in the more basic sense of what it had confirmed about who she was in that moment and what she had been choosing to become over a much longer period than one evening. She said she hadn't known I owned the company. Her voice was very quiet. I told her that was exactly the problem. She had believed how she treated me depended on what I owned. She said that if she had known the truth, she never would have betrayed me. I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. I told her I didn't need a wife who only respected me after she had seen the valuation. Hannah reached for my hand. She asked if we could start over, find a way back to where we had been. I withdrew my hand gently and told her the slap hadn't ended our marriage. It had only shown me the marriage had already ended a long time ago. I asked Jasmine to see the Harper family out. Harold left without looking at me. Evelyn followed without speaking. Kellen walked out last, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. Hannah was the last one through the door. She turned back once briefly, and then the elevator closed. I stayed in the room after they were gone. The board members signed off one by one. Through the window, the city was doing what it always did in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, moving building, indifferent to any individual reckoning happening 34 floors above the street. I gathered the papers into a single stack, set them on the credenza for the legal team, and turned off the projector. Then I took the elevator down and went home. The penthouse I moved into was one I had arranged quietly weeks before the dinner, in the same methodical way I had arranged everything else. It was on the 22nd floor of a building in Midtown, spare, high-ceilinged, with windows that faced west and caught the last hour of light in a way that made the evenings feel longer than they were. I had brought very little with me. Some clothes, the coffee equipment I preferred, a few books, and my father's watch, which never left my wrist, regardless of where I slept. The first week I moved through the space like someone still learning its dimensions, not yet certain I was allowed to feel at ease in my own life. The legal process moved efficiently, as these things do when the documentation is thorough and the financial structures are already in place. My attorneys handled most of it without requiring much of my attention. I signed what needed signing, reviewed what needed reviewing, and otherwise tried to give the machinery of consequence the room it needed to operate without my interference. What I found harder to manage was the quiet, not the absence of noise, but the absence of the low-grade tension that had lived in my chest for the better part of a year. When something has been present long enough, its removal feels strange. Not painful exactly, but unfamiliar in a way that takes time to adjust to. My mother called 4 days after the meeting on the 34th floor. Dorothy Kane had lived in Beaumont her entire life in the same house where she and my father had raised me, and she had a way of asking questions that made it impossible to answer them dishonestly. She asked if it was finished. I told her Tyler had been terminated, the divorce was in process, and the Harper family had been present to hear the truth. There was a moment on the line where I could hear her breathing, thinking, deciding what she actually wanted to know. She asked if I had done anything I would be ashamed of tomorrow. I told her I had used documented evidence, followed the company's legal process, and said only what the record supported. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since, that I hadn't taken revenge. I had simply stopped protecting people from the consequences of their own choices. She said it the way she said most things, without drama, without congratulation, as a plain statement of what was true. I told her I wasn't sure the distinction felt as clean from the inside as it sounded from the outside. She said that was how I knew it was real. If it had felt clean and satisfying all the way through, she'd have worried about me. 3 weeks after the meeting, Hannah sent a message. It came through on a Tuesday evening while I was reading at the kitchen table with the windows open. She said she was sorry for hitting me. She said she wasn't asking for forgiveness, only for the chance to meet once and speak face to face. I read it twice, set the phone down, and didn't pick it up again for several hours. When I did, I opened a new message and began to write. I told her that I forgave her, not for her sake, but because carrying the weight of that night was a price I wasn't willing to keep paying. I wrote that forgiveness and return were not the same thing, and that I had chosen one without the other. I looked at those sentences for a long time. Then I deleted the draft and did not reply. The silence wasn't avoidance. It was a boundary, and for the first time in years I was certain of the difference. The question the legal team brought me was more complicated. They recommended issuing a professional notice to industry contacts regarding Tyler's termination standard practice in circumstances involving financial misconduct, designed to protect partners and clients who might otherwise extend him trust he had not earned. I understood the legitimate purpose. I also understood that I had the authority to make the notice broader or narrower than necessary, and that part of me, the part that had sat at the end of that dinner table while the room laughed at Kellen's jokes, would have found a certain satisfaction in broader. I had to be honest with myself about that. The question my mother had asked, whether I would be ashamed tomorrow, applied here as much as it had applied to the meeting itself. I approved a notification that confirmed the termination, identified the category of financial misconduct with factual specificity, and recommended independent verification before any future engagement. It named no one outside Tyler's professional conduct. It made no reference to Hannah, to the dinner, to the slap, or to anything personal. It was the kind of document that protected the next company that might hire him without destroying the rest of his life, and it was the most I was willing to do. I rejected 2 drafts before settling on the final language. The attorneys seemed mildly surprised by my restraint. I didn't explain it to them. Restraint doesn't require an audience to be real. The rosemary plant arrived from Beaumont 10 days later. My mother had packed it carefully in a box with a note that said only for the new kitchen window. I set it on the sill facing west where it would get the afternoon light and watered it that evening. It looked sparse at first, a few thin stalks in a terracotta pot. Nothing to suggest it intended to stay. But by the end of the first month, new growth had started at the edges, small, bright shoots reaching toward the glass. I found I looked forward to checking on it in the mornings. I started running again early before the city fully woke up. I cooked on weekends the way I had before the marriage consumed most of my available attention. Nothing elaborate, just the rhythm of it. The concentration required, the way a good meal eaten quietly at your own table feels like a kind of argument for your own life. I called my mother every evening, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for longer. I went back into the projects my father had believed in most deeply, infrastructure initiatives in the Gulf region, a mentorship pipeline for young engineers that the company had funded in his name, but that I had let drift over the previous 2 years while other pressures consumed my focus. I tightened the financial ethics protocols across the entire organization, not publicly, not in a way designed to signal anything. Just because the Tyler situation had shown me exactly where the gaps were, and closing them was the work. I want to be careful here about how I describe this period, because it would be easy to shape it into a clean narrative of recovery. The wronged man rebuilds each morning slightly better than the last, the wound healing in an orderly progression toward wholeness. That is not quite how it felt. There were evenings when I sat by the window after dark and remembered the first years with Hannah, the way she had held my hand through the hardest stretch of building the company when the board was fractured and the capital was thin, and I didn't know yet whether any of it was going to hold. I remembered her saying she loved that I was steady. I missed that version of her, and I allowed myself to miss it because pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of dishonesty. Loss is not the same as regret, and I had learned by then to tell the difference. 4 months after the meeting on the 34th floor, I drove to Beaumont and brought my mother back to Houston for a day. We had lunch at a place she had always wanted to try, a restaurant downtown with high ceilings and good light and food that took its time arriving and was worth waiting for. Afterward, we walked in Herman Park, following the path along the reflecting pool while the late afternoon settled around us. She talked about the way she talked about him when she was in a generous mood, not with grief, but with the particular fondness of someone describing a person who had been genuinely worth knowing. She told me about the small things he had paid attention to, the specific coffee she preferred, the jacket she always forgot when the weather changed, the calls he never missed no matter how busy the week had been. She said he had never been a man who needed others to know what he was capable of. His attention was always on the people in front of him, not on the impression he was making. I had heard versions of this before, but something about the timing allowed me to hear it differently. What my father had built the company in its earliest form, the family that surrounded it, the reputation that outlasted him had not been assembled through dominance or spectacle. It had been assembled through constancy, through showing up in the small moments so reliably that the people who depended on him never had to wonder. That was the inheritance more than the assets. That was what I had been trying to protect all along, even in the months when I wasn't sure what I was doing or why. On the drive back to Beaumont, my mother fell asleep in the passenger seat within 20 minutes of leaving the city. I drove without music, watching the highway open up ahead of us in the last of the evening light. I looked down at my father's watch on my wrist, the scratched face, the worn band still keeping time the way it always had. The mark Hannah's ring had left at the corner of my mouth was completely gone by then. The skin had healed cleanly without a scar the way minor wounds usually do when you leave them alone long enough. I thought about Tyler in that moment, and I noticed I wasn't thinking about what had happened to him, or what might happen next. He had made his choices, the company had responded appropriately, and the rest of it was no longer my concern. I thought about Hannah, and I noticed the same thing. Not indifference, but something more like completion. I didn't need her to fully understand what she had lost. I didn't need her to arrive at some particular depth of regret that would confirm the weight of what she had thrown away. The accounting between us was settled, and I had not required her suffering as part of the settlement. What I understood somewhere on that stretch of highway, with my mother sleeping beside me and my father's watch on my wrist, was that the slap had never been the real injury. The real injury had been 6 years of slow erosion of being seen as a placeholder for the man. Hannah had decided I should become of living alongside someone who had confused my restraint for defeat. The slap had been the final gesture of a conclusion that had been building for a long time. And what I felt now on the far side of it was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the particular freedom of a man who no longer had to perform his own value for an audience that had already decided not to see it. The road ahead was long and straight and lit by the last colors of the evening. My mother's breathing was slow and even beside me. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the miles pass. There is a version of this story where the ending is the 34th floor, the projection screen, the audit files, the security team, Tyler leaving through the glass door. That version is satisfying in a particular way. But the real ending happened in a moving car, in ordinary silence 4 months later when I realized I had stopped waiting for the moment that would prove I was right. The moment had already come and gone, and I had barely noticed it because I had been too busy building something worth returning to. That is what my father's watch was always trying to tell me. Not that power belongs to the man who displays it most, but that the man who knows when to put it away and why is the only one worth listening to when he finally speaks. The people who only see your value after learning your title, your salary, or what you own, they were never really seeing you to begin with. You were always worth more than their version of you. And if someone in your life is still waiting for a reason to respect you, maybe what this story is really asking is, why are you still waiting for them to find one? If this story stayed with you, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one waiting, and we'd love to have you here for the next one.